Hello everyone! One of the things I really love about this channel is finding weird stuff and digging through old OVAs and anime to find things that are really out of the box. Things that you can't really tell what they're going for, and things which may not even seem that complete, but do leave you with a deeper sense of curiosity, enchantment, and confusion than you thought were ever possible before. And it's been a while since I have felt such fundamental befuddlement, but today's production of Genocyber has reminded me what it is to be confused. Now, Genocyber is one of the most unique things I've watched on this channel, not because of its graphic gore, which is what people tend to focus on, but because of its uniquely uneven and questionable construction. Some stuff is competent, some stuff sucks, some stuff is even really good objectively, and then there's also a ton of unexplained things and dubbing that just gets worse and worse as the series progresses. It feels like a 4-hour epic, but it's only about 154 minutes long. That's about 2.5 hours, which we should note includes about 20-25 minutes of credits. And even with that short length, it's still broken into 3 basically unconnected plots, riddled across 5 installations. It's more of a ride than a coherent production, but it's so oddly enchanting as there's simultaneously so much and so little here. It's definitely not great. In fact, I don't even know if I'd recommend watching it. But it's not just garbage. But it's not so bad it's good. It's just Genocyber. Now, this was a viewer recommendation, and I'd like to make a quick note that I do accept viewer recommendations. However, since OVAs are shorter, those recommendations are much easier for me to get out of the way than a series suggestion. So I'm working on everything, guys, but it takes a long time. Anyways, Genocyber is a series of OVAs from 1994 that are infamous for their graphic gore, shocking images, and overall nihilistic air. In fact, that's almost exclusively what the series is known for at a tertiary glance, and a lot of people know of it simply for these elements of it. And often it's talked about or remembered more for its shock value, and that's about it. But there is slightly more here. How much more I can't really tell. There's a lot of weird stuff to touch on that we'll try to, but as a series of OVAs that kind of defy explanation, Genocyber itself doesn't really seem to know what it wants to be. I mean, there's semi-solid lore and timelines here, don't get me wrong, but as a whole, Genocyber feels like something, well, full of holes. This isn't helped by an overall air of confusion, often unintentional, a lack of real characters to get connected to, and a sense of burning nihilism? I say the last part because, intentional or not, Genocyber seems to have a seething mass of spite at its core, and I don't know if this is intentional or simply the result of all the excessive gore used for pure shock value. In fact, I don't really know what this thing is. I mean, I can tell you on a surface level that Genocyber is the story of Elaine and how her vaguely explained psychic powers allow her to take the form of an indestructible and murderous monster known as the Genocyber, and I'm quoting here, creature from an imaginary world. Now, when they say imaginary world, I'm assuming they're referencing like a psychic realm or dimension, because that's where the Genocyber gets its power from, and this is just a poor translation, but I can't confirm that. What I can confirm, though, is that Genocyber is basically an unstoppable and extremely dangerous monster. Part 1 is kind of Elaine's backstory and her introduction to the world of Genocyber and the Genocyber itself. Parts 2 and 3 tell of Elaine's fight against the Vajranoid, more on that terminology later, on an aircraft carrier. And parts 4 and 5 take place hundreds of years in the future when a long-dormant Elaine awakens to destroy an evil city. These aren't all that well connected, so we are just kind of look at each on their own, and then I'll draw some overall thoughts I had on the series. Now, part 1 takes place in Hong Kong, and focuses on Elaine as she avoids capture by the evil Kuru group, several mercenaries, a detective, and a bunch of other people who want to capture her for various reasons. Now, the Kuru group is a company which has been conducting experiments into psychic weaponry, and Elaine is in fact the culmination of this, as she, once fused with her sister Diane, can become the Genocyber, which she eventually does at the conclusion of the movie to kill her assailants and avenge Rat, a homeless boy who has basically been the only one to ever show her any kind of actual human decency. Oh yeah, and she also destroys all of Hong Kong, and this is basically the plot of the whole movie. Different parties want to capture Elaine for different reasons, and then she just kills them all. Which is, that's a fine structure for a small OVA. I'm not going to really complain about that. And A semi-competent job is done explaining who Elaine is, where her powers come from, and how she ended up being forced into becoming the Genocyber. As a whole, Part 1 is definitely the most competent, warning, and most interesting by far. In a story sense, it is pretty sloppy, it's not the cleanest told, but there is a coherent vision here, and there's a lot of interesting plot threads to ponder, even if most of them end up burned to a crisp, along with the rest of the city. In a viewing sense, Part 1 stands out to me the most as a very unique and surreal watch. It's extremely gory and vulgar, but those kind of work in this setting, and it feels at least somewhat intentionally sleazy and dirty and uncomfortable. And it feels like whoever made this didn't really quite know how to express themselves the best, but definitely achieved the vibe and tones they were going for. Genocyber Part 1 is not pleasant, but it is a spectacle of sorts, and it's very good at making you uncomfortable, which is arguably the point, or at least it seemed to be the point to me. I can feel the malice here, and it draws me in. There's just a level of underlying discomfort that you can take away from this on almost any level. On a visual level, a lot of this is drawn from some genuinely creative and impressive instances of gore and body humor. Now, I'm not going to talk about this a lot because I'm not the biggest gore guy, but I feel like the gore, in Part 1 at least, is genuinely impressive from a technical standpoint, and I feel like a lot of work went into it, and it's very memorable. It's not the core of any great story, but is done very well here and deserves some artistic praise at the very least. I've heard of this movie being compared to The Thing, John Carpenter's version of it, and I think that's fair, as not only are there blood and guts, but those blood and guts end up twisting and maneuvering in such obviously obscene and disgusting ways that it just gets under your skin, and it's done very well here in an animated form. Although this is not my cup of tea, I must praise the technicals here, as these technicals show a mastery of animating squirmy, wormy inner juices and parts and bits and odds and ends. The technicals also include an oddly impressive use of mixed mediums to create unease in certain shots. Now, when I say this, I mean there are parts in Genocyber where instead of being animated in the traditional style of the piece, we'll flip to like a real-world photograph, or we'll flip to a very obvious different kind of like sketch animation. And I really do like this because it adds some kind of discomfort. Now, it's always kind of weird when an anime will use real-life photographs, and when an anime does this, it's usually done in some kind of psychological context to break our immersion and make us uncomfortable, and Genocyber is no exception to this, as by combining different mediums and different styles of drawings that greatly contrast the overall style of the piece, certain shots are really given very haunting feelings, especially when we consider that these mixed mediums are usually in uncomfortable flashback scenes. We ourselves get uncomfortable because we're like, whoa, what's going on here? I think my favorite example of this is when the detective guy shows his informant a sketch of Elaine, and the sketch is done in a very different, very detailed, very realistic style. And at first, we just see this sketch by itself, so it is immersion breaking, but it's not that weird. But then he shows the sketch in universe to the detective, and we can see the sketch in the same shot as the animated detective, and we see these two different mediums next to each other, and that's where it gets really weird. That's where, like, whoa, what is reality here? And I really like this inconsistency of mediums, as it even kind of mirrors how Elaine's powers warp the reality and perception of those in the film. But discomfort is also derived from how malicious the setup and writing of the piece are. Now, I think this is intentional. I don't know if Tony Takezaki, the guy who wrote this, has some kind of burning grudge against humanity. In fact, I don't really know much about him at all because it's hard finding much about the guy on a basic internet search. Intentional or not, the write-up and setting here are just malicious. To start, Elaine and her sister Diane are seen as nothing more than test subjects and are extremely dehumanized throughout the entirety of the piece. In all honesty, the scenes where they are abused make me more uncomfortable than them just ripping someone's guts out, because they're clearly the victims of abuse and clearly suffering for it, and it just kind of happens until Elaine, as the Genocyber, wipes the slate clean. And by slate, I mean the entire city. Anyways, Elaine's status as a mute furthers this discomfort, as since she can't physically talk, we often see her just kind of screech and grunt when stressed out, and this is just, well, it's just uncomfortable. Even the actual language and terminology of the movie are uncomfortable, as there's constant swearing, And even some of the technical terms are kind of weird. Now, starting with the technical terms, the psychic energy used by the Genocyber is known as Vajra, which is a Buddhist term referencing enlightenment or indestructibility, depending on context. Both of these possible definitions make sense here, though, as the Genocyber is a psychic being that is basically indestructible. However, the pronunciation Vajra sounds like something else to an English-speaking audience, and that, combined with the fact that this is the story about an abused young woman, add another subtle Freudian layer of unease to an English-speaking audience. As for the swearing, it gives the dub its own sleazy hallmark. Now, I can't tell if the dubbing on part 1 is bad or amazing. It's competent, like there's no horrible voice acting or anything, but logically the East Coast accents and extreme vulgarity don't really make sense. But they and their vocabulary also feel very well integrated into this world. I mean, it's a world which is very cruel in a dirty city, and, well, it sounds like it should, in my eyes at least. Yes, it's very vulgar and gross and East Coast, but, you know, that makes sense in this context. I mean, not the East Coast accent doesn't really make sense because it's in Hong Kong, but if I was imagining sleazy city accent, then yeah, it fits. I can't really gauge the story construction either. There is a coherent story and even some backstory here, but they're kind of muddled and or just expositioned away. And this leads to a very disconnected story that, while poorly constructed, at the same time even enhances the obvious sense of disconnect, as the storytelling itself is so disconnected from the audience that it unintentionally enhances the uncomfortable vibes present. Overall, while Genocyber Part 1 is an extremely vulgar, bizarre, and barely coherent piece of sleaze, it is one which excels in the uncomfortable and the excessive, establishing its success in these fields and arguably some kind of niche and legacy. I would not recommend it, or even say it's that good, but I think it's more than just garbage and does show a level of technical expertise and a really weird window into the mind of the creative team. I mean, it is an extremely unique piece, and one of the few where a lack of storyboarding, coherence, and or competence might even have inadvertently benefited it. I don't think I would watch this again, but I'm definitely not going to forget having watched it. And it does have some kind of merit. And then there's part 2, and 3, and 4, and 5. Now, parts 2 and 3 are 2 parts of one story, so we're going to talk about them as a single story. In this story, Elaine, named Laura by Dr. Myra, fights another superweapon made by another mad scientist from the Koryu Corporation. We open with Elaine in a war zone watching as her friends die. Then she becomes the Genocyber and destroys the guilty helicopters, prompting the Koryu group to be sought for assistance by the US Navy. While Koryu goons board the aircraft carrier, Alexandria, Elaine is brought aboard by a recovery plane. Once on board, she bonds with Dr. Myra, who seeks her to take the place of her dead daughter. A daughter who Genocyber killed in Part 1, although no one knows that yet. Finally, the superweapon, known as the Vajranoid, also activates on the aircraft carrier and then has 2 fights with Elaine, blows up in the first one but is then revived and fuses with the aircraft carrier in the second one, and basically everyone except Elaine and Myra die. Myra is then rescued, finds out that Elaine killed her daughter, goes mad, and Elaine then just kind of burns the city of Karen to the ground, the country that started this war in the first place. If you're expecting me to spend just as long on parts 2 and 3 as I did on the first one, sorry! The fact of the matter is that parts 2 and 3 simply lack a lot of the unique weirdness part 1 brings to the table. Everything here is just more meh. I mean, the plot's still kind of jumbled and the visuals aren't anywhere near as standout as part 1. In fact, there's overall less gore, and it just feels less creative and excessive. There's none of the weird mixed medium stuff, and overall this installment just feels a lot less memorable. Even the dialogue is more bland, as the dubbing just sounds more generic in terms of accents, and ironically, the episode featuring sailors has a lot less swearing. I mean, the dialogue just isn't as memorably vulgar or weird. Now, if I did have to praise these pieces, I would say that it is nice seeing that people in this piece tend to treat Elaine with human decency. Most of the crew is actually pretty nice to her, and Elaine herself does seem to show some kind of character growth as she goes out of her way to protect Myra. But other than that, that's about it. I mean, it's also nice seeing the rude scientist man blow up, but this feels like it has a lot less of the overall vision and creative weirdness that went in the part 1. And overall, it's just less experimental and suffers for this. Part 1 feels like an exciting and intriguing mess, and Part 2 feels like a semi-competent stroll through some kind of blood and guts horror piece. I mean, it's not the worst use of 45 minutes, but I would definitely recommend Part 1 over Parts 2 and 3. And finally, that gets us to Parts 4 and 5. These places take place in the far future after the Genocyber-induced apocalypse, and star the couple Ryu and Mel in Arc de Grand City. Arc de Grand City is a dystopian hellhole, and Ryu and Mel seek ways to make money in order to help cure Mel's blindness. Now they get caught up in government crackdowns and a church which holds the dormant Genocyber in high regard, although they don't really know what it is. And eventually Mel is killed, but this awakens the Genocyber, who in turn kills the city and revives Mel so that she and Ryu can play Adam and Eve. Now this installment is weird. This installment seems to instead focus on Ryu and Mel as a couple and the idea of religion? I don't really know what they wanted to talk on, really, if I'm being honest. I mean, religion is a key point in this, I think, but it's just some kind of surface level commentary. Nothing too offensive or thought-provoking, just a group of believers unknowingly assigning religious importance to a man-made monster. And while you could argue that this is the piece saying how man is arrogant and playing God and creating horrible things which shouldn't exist and all this kind of commentary on man's place in the world, I'm going to be blunt and say that I don't think this is supposed to be a commentary, because I don't think the Genocyber Parts 4 and 5 are that deep. I don't think Genocyber as a whole is that deep. There's also a decent amount of focus on Ryu and Mel, and I also really like the setting of Arc de Grand City. In fact, of all the settings in all the Genocyber installments, I feel like this one had the most atmosphere and the most potential, because it really is such a unique and dystopian hellhole. A lot could have been done here, and I do like the setup of a church worshipping the Genocyber, as it does feel like something you would find in the sewers of some city hellscape, like Coruscant or something. I feel like overall Part 4 and 5 had the most potential, as there are a lot of these weird little pieces that some kind of unique narrative could have been pieced together from, and there are some cool standout visual elements as well. I would go as far to say that Parts 4 and 5 work better as a standalone piece, as without knowing they're Genocyber pieces, we don't have any kind of bias to really cloud our expectations. Now that's not to say that these are perfect though, and they do have a lot of issues. While the plot is linear enough to follow here, a lot of things are just not explained and show up on screen. Like this dragon ship thing that I was wondering, oh, I wonder what that is, that seems cool, okay, it's gone. In addition, this upper class of Arc de Grand City is comically evil to the point of undermining their own goals, and it doesn't feel like some kind of satire or commentary either. It just feels like someone genuinely went, let's just make everyone as evil as possible, to the point where it kind of hampers our suspension of disbelief. Worst of all, though, is the English dubbing. Now, I don't hold the dub of any series against them, as this is not the original language that any of these pieces were broadcast in, so I don't think it's fair to include that if I'm judging a piece that's originally in Japanese. But I gotta say that Parts 4 and 5 have some of the worst dubbing I have seen in a while. I mean, it's been going downhill since Part 2, but the dubbing here has gotten to the point where it's just bad. It's not corny, it's not weird, it's not so bad it's good, it's just unenjoyably, painfully bad. And I don't like being negative on this channel, but I gotta say it sucks. It's a painful listen. Mel and the priest are fine, but everyone else here cannot act out of a paper bag. Now, I'm sure they can if they had like actual vocal direction, but it's either that no direction was given, or the direction given was just wrong, as none of the voice acting sounds different depending on what's going on. Everyone just kind of talks like this, and explains things in an odd and stunted manner. I cannot believe that a piece with this kind of tone is that easy to get into. They could only manage to get the legendary Dick King to mix their dubbing for episodes 1 through 3, and his absence is definitely noticeable for Parts 4 and 5, as overall the dubbing is just much, much worse. In fact, I don't even see a dubbing mixer listed for Parts 4 and 5 in the credits, although to be fair that the mixer is probably not the person in the booth, so that probably doesn't really have any impact on the actual delivery, and I just like saying Dick King. However, this does bring up the odd factoid that Parts 4 and 5 were not dubbed until much later than Parts 1 through 3. You see, due to rights and stuff, episodes 1 through 3 were dubbed much earlier than parts 4 and 5, and the dubbing for parts 1 through 3 were done by Manga Entertainment UK and Australian divisions, and this was released in a collection along with some other cyberpunk OVAs. Parts 4 and 5, however, were not dubbed until US Manga Corps could obtain the rights to dub these other parts, and this was done by Central Park Media, and the difference in quality is quite obvious. This also explains why most of the names don't necessarily reappear, and why Diane sounds a little different than from her appearances in Part 1. Overall, though, I feel like Parts 4 and 5 have the most potential, but also the most bungling. Overall, make them an odd, disjointed end to an odd and disjointed series about something. I don't know, and that's really what I would call Genocyber if I had to call it anything. I would call it something, and that brings us to a disjointed conclusion of a disjointed video about a disjointed series of disjointed OVAs. I'm going to note a few overarching elements here, and then call it a video. I feel like I should point out that of the 154 minutes of footage here, I want to say that at least 20 are just consumed by end credits, which make me question how much work and people and resources went into this when it already doesn't seem to be the best thing ever, but you have 20 minutes of credits. It's kind of comical, in fact, how long these credits are, and of course in those credits is listed the name of Dick King, whose work we also admired in Tokyo Babylon. One of the things about Genocyber that really stood out to me that I haven't brought up yet, though, is the fact that its OST is actually incredibly good. For a small, weird OVA that doesn't really go anywhere and it only lasts for about 2.5 hours, the OVA is probably one of the most consistently best OVAs I've heard in one of these things. Every single song is impactful and atmospheric, and there's a good few motifs to make the OST sound like an interconnected and living being. I think the music really knocks it out of the park and is one of the standout features of this piece that I didn't really notice until I started recording B-roll for it. Once I started to listen to these songs more and more, I realized that they were very good and really do help sell a lot of the action scenes and even a lot of the slower scenes present in Genocyber. They really do flesh out the atmosphere in this piece and give its episodes life when its dubbing and even some of its plot strings may fail to consistently at all times. Unfortunately, something else that stands out is a lack of characters throughout the series, which is what I would consider a prevalent issue of Genocyber in its entirety. Not every story needs to be a character story, and not every character in every story needs to be very well written. However, usually you need some kind of characters and characterization if you want to tell any kind of plot, and this is not the kind of piece that can get by on spectacle and themes alone. I mean, Genocyber maybe, I think, could get by on spectacle alone. I'd give that a pass there. But parts 2 through 5 definitely cannot. And this really draws our attention to how middling the characters and character development is. There's Elaine, who is the main character, and I guess we feel bad for her, but she doesn't really communicate much with the audience, which is possible via her few inner monologues. And while we do feel bad for her, we also gotta realize that she's the one burning down cities full of innocent bystanders, and then that makes you go, well, you know, is she really that innocent? Is this really someone we should root for? If I'm being honest, everyone in these pieces just falls into one of two camps. There's the camp of decent but extremely passive and or useless bystanders who are destroyed by the events around them after getting nothing done, and then there's the camp of raging assholes that lead to the destruction in the first place. There's no one that doesn't fit into one of these two categories, and neither category has anything near what I would consider a compelling member of the cast. And Elaine herself isn't really that interesting. I mean, we do feel bad for her, but she's just not developed, and she doesn't really have that much screen time when we really boil things down. There aren't really characters, and there aren't really stand-ins for ideas, or even the audience either. There's just animated bodies to help get the stunted plot to limp along. This gets to my final thought on Genocyber, which is the question of, what happened? Why do we have 3 basically unrelated plots, and why split 2 of those into 2 separate 20-minute installments? What's the goal of that? What's the goal of Genocyber as a whole? How much planning went into this, and was there any unifying plan in the first place? What happened to Genocyber? Now looking at part 1, yes, part 1 is definitely a disjointed, graphic, exploitive, excessive, sleazy, shallow, disgusting, crass mess. but it embraces that, and it excels in that regard, and it definitely has potential, and is definitely a memorable experience. I don't know if it's the best memory, but it's a memory that'll stay with me for a long time, and it's definitely something that makes the piece worth watching if you want to see something that is very shocking and weird and want to feel confused or unsettled. It does have some kind of merit, I would say, even if it's not my personal cup of tea. And I will remember it, and I can tell that the tone and visuals that it wanted to convey are conveyed competently, even if the framing around them isn't the most competent. Part 1 sets a very rough, but very definite trajectory for later installments, and it feels like it has some kind of vision that could have possibly been built upon to construct something great. Something gory and disgusting, but something great. But then the sequels fail to do this, and kind of just abandon this vision as they progress along. I mean, Genocyber is barely in parts 4 and 5 for gosh sakes. The series could have been so much more if they had simply stuck with what made part 1 so memorable, and then worked and refined those elements as they went along. I think there was potential here not only for a disgusting gore fest, but a disgusting gore fest that had comparing lore, characters, and visuals. While excessive gore and vulgarity are not necessary core elements to any good story, and can even detract from one if they are in excess, if you are going to make some kind of shock piece where they are basically one of the core points of the series or piece, then you should embrace those elements of it. Because while they're not core elements of a great story or needed elements, if they are core points of your story, then yeah, they're kind of important if you want to tell it. And part 1 is a masterful demonstration of this. I wouldn't consider it a tight production by any means, but it is a memorable production because it embraced what it wanted to embrace. Now what I mean by this is that while there is still a lot of gore and weird body horror, how that is conveyed and how a lot of stuff in general is conveyed is not as visually creative as in part 1. In part 1 we saw the use of real life photography, of sketches, of weird sketch animation, of a lot of different mixed medium stuff, of live bugs even, to give us an air of unease by every now and again interrupting how information is portrayed to the viewer. However, parts 2 through 5 doesn't really have this. I think there's like 2 shots of sketches here, maybe, and other than that, everything is just done in the traditional animation style. So, while there is a near equal, if not equal amount of gore and body weirdness, the fact that it's all portrayed uniformly, and the fact that there is no real break from the traditional animated medium presence in parts 2 through 5, mean that a more consistent portrayal of everything makes it less experimental and therefore less disturbing, and if I'm gonna say it, interesting. Yes, the content is the same, but it also matters how that content is given to the viewer. In addition, the smaller scale of the plot and the smaller scope of everything means that there isn't really any mystery to further any unease that we could get from what's happening on screen. Part 1 is a giant mess of conspiracy and intrigue that's never really explained, although that works to its favor. Where parts 2 through 5, more of a simple monster fights monster story in which everyone happens to die and that there's a girl with weird psychic powers. So why tone these elements down in later installments? It really feels like parts 2 through 5 should have doubled down on the different mixed medium stuff so that they felt just as weird and unsettling as part 1, so that they kept its spirit alive, so that people would gush over parts 2 through 5 as much as they gush over part 1. This would make us more uncomfortable, and it would make the pieces more sleazy and disgusting and unsettling overall, but that's arguably the point. And why stray from the point of any objective? I'm not disappointed in parts 2 or 5 for their gore or swearing, don't get me wrong, they still have a good amount of these things, but I'm disappointed in them for how they abandoned the core premises of what made for, at least in my eyes, a very unique and bizarre concept. Genocyber Part 1 is very sleazy, disgusting, and uncomfortable, but it is Genocyber 1. As I said earlier, it is just Genocyber. It's something. And this gives it some kind of leg to stand on that parts 2 through 5 simply don't have. Now, if for some reason you do want to watch Genocyber, I don't personally recommend it, then I would say you can just stop after part 1. Part 1 has some good music, some genuinely impressive gore and body horror shots, don't get me wrong, some of the technicals here are great, as well as some mixed media creativity and the most spectacle out of any of these. It's what you would expect. It's what people hype up when they hype up Genocyber. And it's not like any of the later pieces compensate with any kind of awesome character development or grand plot either. I mean, you can watch all 5 pieces if you want to, it's your life, feel free to, but I will warn you that it's all downhill once those end credits start up for the first time. So yeah, that's my view on Genocyber. It's a thing, this was a viewer suggestion, and, you know, thanks for suggesting this, whoever did. I mean, thanks, I guess. Thanks for giving me a video idea. But I don't really know if I would recommend Genocyber. I would say that part 1 has some kind of artistic merit, and it is interesting and worth a watch, with the caveat that you don't mind some gore and swearing, and graphic, unsettling scenes. However, past part 1, I don't really think there's much to Genocyber, if I'm being honest. And yeah, that's just my take on it. I don't really know how to end this video, so I guess I'll just end it in the same disjointed way Genocyber does. Bye!